On Rebuilders today, we are chatting about civilizational decline.
Just a small topic. Looking at, the question that many are asking, is our civilization in decline? But also, how does the framework of civilizational decline also point us towards the potential of civilizational renewal? And what does this tell us as the church? What is the special source ingredients that turn around moments of decline?
Great. Well, we look forward to sharing this with you. As always, if you want to know more about the resources that were mentioned during this episode, you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co. Let's get into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name's Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel, who were bringers of pastry today. The pastries are back.
Well, let the people hear. Let the listeners of Rebuilders hear. We've heard you. We've even travelled overseas and heard this face to face. We've taken the rebuke. We have been negligent on the pastries front, but today, no, the pastries are back. And there was actually a wonderful symmetry to getting of the pastries. Daniel suggested
a poetic symmetry.
So Daniel suggested that we get pastries, and he's actually crunching on a raspberry.
I don't know if you can hear that.
This is not ASMR, Daniel.
ASMR. A pastry.
ASMR pastry.
So carry on, Mark.
Sorry. So long-term listeners will remember that the pastries began as we coped with lockdown.
Yes.
And often we would be doing lockdown in here, just us. We were able to broadcast.
We weren't doing all of lockdown here.
No. We would come in. We'd come in to record. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
And then often here in Victoria, in Melbourne, Victoria's our state, Melbourne's our city, we would be watching the 11 o'clock update with our state premier, Daniel Andrews, who's like the equivalent of the governor of our state, probably the second most powerful politician in our country. And we would watch his update and we'd hear the numbers and what was going to go on. So that was sort of like this daily thing, pastries and watching the Daniel Andrews update, second most powerful politician in Australia. So
it got us through.
So we just then, fast forward to 2022 and September 2022, almost over 2 years.
Actually, sorry, just a quick one. This is the first September in 3 years we've not been in lockdown.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that makes the symmetry even more stunning,
trifecta.
sir.
I mean, the listeners are really waiting for this
I'm building it up.
announcement.
I'm building this up.
You ham it up.
So did you say ham?
Yeah, I did say ham.
No, this is a kosher joke.
Ham would have been good in my pastry. Sorry, continue.
Okay, so Daniel and I take off to get pastries. And we pull around the corner to a new cafe that's actually opened recently and which the office is visiting regularly. And we knew they had good pastries. We pull around the corner and I go, there he is, the premier of our state, who we watched all those days in daily press conferences. He's just sitting out the front having a coffee.
Yeah.
Daniel Andrews having a coffee out the front of our local thing, the second most powerful politician in the country. He's just having a coffee in the sun.
Yep.
We grabbed our pastries. And it's just a natural symmetry to the end of a period of our lives.
Yeah.
It was like one or two security, but we couldn't even really tell that there was security until we're like, there's a little walkie-talkie, poking at that pocket.
I knew you were thinking the same thing. I noticed both of us would be like, there's the premier, Daniel Andrews, and then within minutes, is there security? Where is the security?
Both of you would have been looking shifty as.
They did look at us when we walked past. They were like, do you notice they scoped us? As we walked past.
Yep.
But it was actually pretty good security. You couldn't really tell who was security until we'd been watching them for about 5 minutes.
Well, there was that drone that was just following us around.
Yeah, predator drone, like a kilometre up in the air.
Yeah.
But there you go.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So we've entered this episode with not only pastries, but a fantastic anecdote.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it. And I guess in a way, as you've already flagged, it kind of marks the end of an era, the beginning of a new one.
Yes.
Pastries reign supreme.
Yes. I hereby declare grey zone over. The pastry epoch has begun.
Make it rain.
Well, on that very triumphant note, I'm just going to let you guys know what we're going to be talking about today, which is civilizational decline and renewal
through pastries.
Well, actually not through pastries. I'm sorry to disappoint you all. The other week, Mark, you spoke, you delivered a sermon at Red, and you were speaking about civilizational decline. Seemingly an odd topic for a sermon. Why was this important for you to chat about, and what are we going to be exploring today?
Well, a couple of reasons. So firstly, there's lots of conversation about civilizational decline online, and people are revisiting this sort of concept. And, you look at, I guess, many of the long-term trends that we've been following on Rebuilders, even going back to our Networked World series, has been around issues of significant crises that cascade through the global network. And, increasingly people sort of, are moving from, had a period of talking about the pandemic, and it depends, it's different in different countries. I'm very aware of that. But now we're talking about things that we were sort of foreshadowing a while ago, supply chain issues have turned into energy issues, looking at the European winter, Ukraine war, and a lot of questions being asked, where is the sort of Western culture at? Where is developed world culture? Where is global culture at? Are we in some kind of sort of irreversible decline? And we've got a lot of cultural memories that sort of move around our head in terms of that. We think of Rome, and Roman. People talk about the decline of Rome. So I think that's one reason to talk about where we're at with that. And is that an accurate way of looking at culture? But I think also it's a really helpful way of actually also looking at institutions.
Yeah.
Now, I would posit that any human social order that we do together, where we do repeated patterns, which are aiming towards some kind of human flourishing in the future, is a good way of looking at institutions. So I think churches, Christian organizations are all institutions, so are cities. And even the word civilization is really interesting. There's probably a little bit of a recoil from the word civilization, how in later years it was mistermed in terms of sort of civilization versus barbarism. And even you do see that in Rome. But if you look at the word civilization, it's interesting, it comes from the sort of Latin word of, civics or civil, meaning a social order, the way that humans get together and do things together for a purpose. That's really the basic understanding of it. So I think that's actually an interesting way, or even cité, cité in French, it's like from civics, it's like humans are social creatures, as Aristotle said, and we tend to get together and do stuff. So looking at also the civilizational sort of decline model or framework is a really helpful way to ask the question, where's the church at? Where are Christian organizations at? And we know lots of people listening to this are leaders, and that then gives us a framework to understand. But also this podcast is also about renewal.
Yes.
So, can institutions be renewed? Can cultures be renewed? And this is an interesting way of looking at that.
Okay, great. Well, let's start by looking at these stages of civilizational decline. So you've put these together?
Yes. So this is my little version of it.
Yes.
But just quickly to give people a history of this, I mean, this has been something people have been interested in for a long time. If you go back to, say, the Roman satirist Juvenal, who basically, he's the famous term bread and circuses. He talked about Rome's sort of decline, of when, the sort of leadership of Rome sort of just was feeding people bread and giving them entertainment in circuses. And there's almost a sense of that Rome had entered a moral decline, and talk about the fall of Rome. It's hard to sort of say when was the actual decline of Rome, because Rome continued in some sort of form or another for some time. But, probably the most famous person who really looked at this in sort of a formulaic way was the Arabic medieval scholar Ibn Khaldun. And he looked at these different ways in which different generations of people, built something and then it declined. And, he's often been called the father of sociology. He looked in a sort of systematic way. But then, people like Spengler in the 20th century, Oswald Spengler, became really popular again in the 1930s when sort of Europe was sort of looking at decline, and all kinds of ideas bounce off this. I wrote about the beat poets, Jack Kerouac and Ginsberg and stuff in my book, The Road That Changed the World. They were reading Spengler and saw themselves as, he had this term of the Fedayeen, who were this sort of group on the edge, which also I think pop up in June. So these ideas just infuse our culture. Think about science fiction and dystopian motifs are often built upon a concept of decline. You know, we talk about things like cyberpunk, where you had in the 1950s, when there was a sense of more optimism about culture, you had very shiny futuristic visions of the future.
Yes.
Think about the first sort of Star Trek, the future was sort of this Jetsons, and but then you have something like Blade Runner, where it's like the future is actually not that great.
Yes.
And sort of as sort of nihilism permeates our sort of view of the future. So this is something that's everywhere. Some people push back on it. Bruno Massais, who we've quoted on this podcast a number of times in his book about the USA, he sort of pushes back on civilizational study. He says it's more an evolution. But I think it's still a helpful way of, framework of just looking at how things grow, decline, and so on. And so I've come up with 5 stages. So I've sort of taken the Khaldun sort of model and sort of made my own version of it. That's what I used in the sermon. So we can have a look at my little version of it.
Great. All right. Well, we're going to start first generation. The first generation builds the civilization. They build it.
Well, yeah. So any institution, so again, too, it's not just necessarily civilization. It's anything that people come together. You often find a first generation that builds something. Ibn Khaldun talked about this. They had to sort of come together for a particular reason. And, these in a sense are the sort of pioneers, the innovators, the creators. This is sort of the startup at the beginning.
Yes.
Very much when you look at this could be a church planter starting something. There's a vision. It doesn't exist in the real world. And, it's brought into being. And it's interesting too, because I think there's actually quite an interesting biblical sort of motif here. You look at Genesis 1, I think it's verse 26, where it sort of go forth and multiply, rule and subdue. This idea of humans are, in part of our imago Dei, our image of God, is that there's something in us which is created by the Creator, therefore we have sort of the ability to create and the drive to create. So creating something out of nothing, which again too mimics creation ex nihilo, at the beginning of Scripture. But in order to build, the first generation often will have to sacrifice.
Yes,
It's tremendously hard to start something from nothing. So not only have I come up with sort of there's the first generation, what it does is builds it, but also sort of came up with this idea of there's almost an ethic that goes with that.
Yeah.
So the first generation builds it, but the ethic I would say is they do that through sacrifice.
Yeah, okay.
And you have to give a lot. Jesus talks about in the Gospels counting the costs before you do something. This generation will often, count the costs, sacrifice, pour. It's very rare to see anything born with a half effort.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, once I guess it's set up and this group have sacrificed, the second generation maintain it.
Yeah. So often if you think about it too, like there's a first generation and, think about maybe a generation who migrates to a country. Their parents migrate to a country. They might keep going with some of the traditions from their previous country. They respect their parents of how much their parents sacrifice for them. So in a sense, the second generation maintains it, and almost the ethic they have is service. So they're relationally still connected to sort of their parents' generation. And look, I'm being loose here. This is not an exact science by any means. And I'm not saying it's, always going to be grandparents, parents, kids sort of deal. But the second generation, what tends to happen is the first generation has these ethics of sacrifice and they tend to codify that. It's passed on.
Yes.
They teach their kids this. They teach the organization this. They teach the institution these values. This is why we did it. And you remember.
Yeah.
In Australia and New Zealand, you have something called, the Anzac tradition, which is the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, which is our, sort of in many ways sort of births of the nations. Canada has something, similar, where, in a sense, as sort of former British colonies, we almost came to sort of national identity in First World War when we had to sort of fight for ourselves. And you have this thing which is lest we forget, always remembering the sacrifice of that first generation. So, following generations will go and they'll have things of remembrance. So you want to keep, in some ways, the first generation comes up with some sort of social technology or some kind of idea which makes a difference in the world and is moving us towards flourishing. So the next generation they move more into an ethic of service.
Yes.
They're not sacrificing because in a sense a lot of the sacrificial work has been done, but they're servicing, maintaining what that first generation fought for, the breakthroughs that they had, that keeps going. But it tends to be codified. And often people sort of have this really binary between it becomes institutionalized at this stage. And I do talk about, I think it's in Disappearing Church, the difference between, it's Facing Leviathan, where I talk about this sort of false dichotomy between the organic and the mechanical, or the sort of like organic idea of a community, and then it becomes institutionalized, and that's the death of it.
Yeah.
I think institutionalizations are much more developmental. It's not like a binary thing, but second generation maintains it.
It's kind of, you've just made me think of another example that's probably less sort of defeatist as, something becoming institutionalized, but languages. So Pidgins and Creoles, these are languages that emerge in sort of isolated communities. And a pidgin is something that's created, I think I'm getting my terms right, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone out there. But pidgins are created by a first generation, and it's a language that functions between two communities that haven't originally spoken this language. It becomes a Creole, it becomes an established language when the second generation have picked it up and start learning it.
Interesting.
And then, that's a way that people can connect and find identity through using language. So there's an example. So the third generation, let us move on. The third generation assumes it.
So first generation builds it, second generation maintains it, third generation assumes it. So in a sense, the breakthroughs that the first generation has eked out of nothingness, that the second generation have then institutionalized and codified, and some sort of flourishing has been established. This might be a health fund, this could be a town, this could be a school, this could be a church.
Yes.
And what they do is they put these things into play that have created flourishing, but this third generation assumes that that's actually the natural way of the world. So the first generation had this idea of before they created the thing and after they created the thing, and they created the thing in order to make the world better and to move towards some flourishing. The second generation has a living memory of that. But this is almost, again, like the grandparents fought for it. The second generation sort of learnt from their grandparents why it's important to keep going. The third generation just assumed that it's always been like this. So to move to the migrant example, first generation gets on a plane, moves to the other side of the world, works hard jobs, absolutely, grafts so that their kids can go to university. Their kids go to university, get good jobs, they integrate into the culture, lead a middle-class life. And then the third generation assume that's what it's been like.
Yes.
Their grandparents are distant memory who turns up at family events and they talk to them, but the sacrifice that they made, is distant from them.
Yes, okay.
And what this does, so if the first generation has an ethic of sacrifice and the second generation has an ethic of service, the third generation has an ethic of entitlement.
Yeah.
So entitlement is wanting benefits without taking any responsibility.
Yes.
And so, that's where in some ways I think that decline starts to settle in. So you start to assume like it's always been like this. I don't really have to do anything to keep it going.
Yes.
This is just how the world is. And the flourishing that others fought for is simply assumed and taken for granted.
So nobody is working towards keeping it going, essentially.
And almost the momentum of you're coasting on the momentum of previous pioneers.
Yes, okay. So then we move to the fourth generation, and the fourth generation neglects it.
Yeah. So, it's like a car, you might have a car that you assume you don't have to, like, just say I've got a car for 3 years and I just assume that I don't need to take care of it and I never get a service and I never pump up the tires or check the oil or whatever. I can do that for a little bit. But then if I pass that on to you and you go, well, I'm not going to do any of those things, at some point it starts to break down.
Yeah.
And this is what happens here. So the fourth generation neglects it. But also what can happen at this point is entitlement will inevitably lead to some form of corruption. Now, this could be moral corruption, this could be economic corruption, or it just could be a corruption of the breakthrough innovation that the first generation had.
Yeah, got you.
So this could be, a company decides that it has this purpose, or an NGO or a church, but the actual mission at this point is so drifted that it actually becomes corrupted in of itself.
Yes.
Or the other thing that can happen is the benefits that have been eked out by, so it could be like this. It could be, let's do the migrant thing. First generation moves countries, huge sacrifice, works night shift. Second generation gets to go to university, appreciates it. Third generation just lives off the benefit of the previous generation. The fourth generation throws all the money away and, finds himself, living on the street because they've lived a dissolute life or something like that. That's a sort of, very crude outplay of it. But it's really that idea there that inevitably entitlement will move to some sort of corruption of the individual or the mission or the institution itself.
Yeah. Okay. So finally, things are starting to look a little bit dismal here, Mark.
Yes.
The fifth generation buries it.
So the original thing that was built,
yes,
the original breakthrough is forgotten, and this generation buries the institution. So there's sort of a natural lifespan, you see, of many institutions, and again, we're painting incredibly broadly here. At this point, it buries it. Now, interesting, I'd say, just to go through again the ethics, first generation builds it, they have an ethic of sacrifice. Second generation maintains it, they have an ethic of service. Third generation assumes it, they have an ethic of entitlement. The fourth generation neglects it, which creates an ethic of corruption. And the fifth generation buries it, and there's grief. They begin to look back and think what has been lost.
Yes.
And they're like, oh, hang on, things are actually quite bad now. Man, we've really messed this up. So there's a sense of grief. There's a sense of looking back. You think of someone like, or you would see people looking back in the Dark Ages at the sort of ruins of Rome, and like, how did they manage to build columns and buildings like that? We don't know how to do that, and you miss it. There's almost nostalgia can really come in at this point.
Okay.
So that's sort of the cycle.
All right. So, I'm not seeing it as a cycle just yet because you've painted it as this decline.
Yes.
Let's just take a step back and ask why does decline actually happen? You've started to kind of get at it.
Yes. Okay. So again, going back to the, I guess, diagnostic. So I talked about a number of people who've come up with this sort of pattern, and then why did they see this? So Juvenal, I mentioned before, he saw it ultimately that Rome became morally corrupt because of comfort.
Okay.
So there's a sense that people become so comfortable that leads to luxury, and luxury inevitably leads to some form of moral corruption.
Which is essentially, you've got your entitlement and corruption.
Yes.
There, yeah.
And so comfort inevitably leads to a moral decline. And these are the stories we hear again. Rome is sort of often put up as the example of this, where you see, later Roman life is, sort of debauched, and there's the Colosseum and, sacrifice of people, and people watch, paying to watch animals chewing up people. It's like, it's quite a moral, sort of morally decrepit sort of vision. Ibn Khaldun, he saw it as the Arabic medieval scholar. He saw it as the first generation had to have a sense of social cohesion. They had to band together.
Yes.
That sort of created this almost drive, this communal drive to something. But as comfort kicks in, it begins to fragment and individualism takes over. Again, fascinating. He's running the medieval period, father of modern sociology, as many call him, and he outlines that individualism is something that happens in decline. So then what happens is things become so disparate in the later stages that there is no cohesion, no community, no overarching thing that we're all fighting for. And then he said someone else will come in. So this is sort of Spengler sort of went here, and Ibn Khaldun, that eventually they'll get conquered by another. So a very popular book at the moment is Ray Dalio's, I forgot what it's called, but he's sort of done his own global orders book, the sort of American investor. And he talks about a new rising power will then conquer the weakened, disparate, corrupt, bigger power. So he looks at things like debt and education and so on. And he buys Graham Allison's written a book called Destined for War, which is about China as a rising power and the US as possibly a declining power. Going back to the Peloponnesian War with Thucydides, it's a tongue twister, who wrote about how, Sparta and Athens were like these two powers. So that's another idea. And Spengler sort of looked at that. So part of in the 1930s, this fear that you saw in liberal democracies was that the rising forces of Bolshevism or communism and fascism had more of an energy. They were more like willing to sacrifice, and they had greater elan to sort of fight these sort of corrupt, comfortable, elites. And, so that's fear sort of you see a little bit in the popular thing at the moment. And even in the sort of competition between the US and China you hear about at this point in time, you'll see this sort of in the internet and different places in the news. So, part of also like what I would also look at is possibly what happens is, and this is what I was sort of trying to write when I wrote my very first book called The Trouble with Paris, was that almost this detachment from reality also begins to happen. You become so detached from reality that the culture falls into fantasy.
Yes.
And Wall-E is an example of this. To use go from the Peloponnesian War to Wall-E, in that people become almost they trash the world through their. I mean, it's partially as moral corruption in that movie around, they're unable to walk and they just. Or another one is Idiocracy. Have you ever seen that? Idiocracy?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. So it's like a dumb comedy. I think it's got one of the Wilson brothers, the third least famous Wilson brother.
Oh, Luke Wilson.
And in that movie, basically, it starts with you've got a guy and two couples, a couple who are like this upper educated couple, and they're like, oh, we're going to have a kid, but we want to finish our university. We're going to have a kid, but we want to get our apartment right. We're going to have a kid. So they keep putting off have a kid.
Yeah.
And then you got this other guy who's sort of like working class, who's just like popping out kids left, right and center.
Yeah.
So they follow that trend line of what happens if, the educated people don't have kids and then the sort of lower class uneducated.
Okay.
And they get to the future and just they've trashed the world and they don't know how to drink water. They drink Gatorade and the president is a wrestler. It's worth seeing it alone just for the president's speech in Congress where he's firing, I think, an AK-47 and he rocks around on a massive, like, I don't know, monster sort of bike or something.
I love that you've watched that. Well done.
Yeah, high and low culture. It's what it's all about. So there's some of the reasons that people look at, around decline.
Okay. That's, really helpful to understand.
Could I add one more? I did sort of hint at it before. Like mission drift, I think, is another one where the primary reason that and maybe I'm looking more in big civilizational, but I think you would look at something, an institution which, say, begins for a particular reason, but then its mission is so drifted that it ends up closing because it's not doing what it was originally started for.
Yeah, okay.
It becomes a zombie institution.
Yeah. Well, I mean, going through this, you can see so much of this occurring, or I guess see it painted out across the last number of generations that we've lived through. So let's take some time to have a look at where are we at, I guess, socially, if we're to look at maybe the West.
Yeah.
Where would you kind of place us in this framework?
Well, I mean, part of the story we've been telling with this podcast is, there is a sense where we assumed a lot about the world. And, probably what we've been talking about a little bit, like things like energy and that the power will always be on, that supply chains will keep working, that you won't get locked down by a pandemic, that war may not happen, war probably won't ever happen again in the West. All of that is being smashed. So there's an element that I think definitely we're well into, if not through the third generation assumes it and has entitlement.
Yes.
I think it's Henry Cloud's book, Entitlement. I think when you did the internship, Daniel, we got you guys to read that.
Yes, the Entitlement Cure.
Entitlement Cure. That's something that's spoken about a lot at an individual level, the sense of entitlement in people today.
That was John Townsend.
John Townsend, sorry. So I think both individually but also corporately as the West, there's a sense of, I think, entitlement and assumption that we can have this world. And that's created, I think, a lot of the conversations. We've also talked around here, I think, Ronald Englehart's sort of scale of security, and identity, that if your security is assumed, your existential questions are more around issues of identity and self-expression. When scarcity comes along and your security is more up in question, it's more basic, the questions, So I think all of that is happening. So I guess it's really, I would guess, depends what country you are, but, we're somewhere, you look at Europe has got some, as we recall, there's some significant energy crises coming, particularly for the European winter is going to be, quite difficult. We look at the environmental, China, I think, just announced it's the worst drought on record.
Wow.
Europe, 500 years or something, triple dip El Nino is happening. so you got significant environmental stuff going on, which we assumed perhaps we had longer or we could put off. You've got political sort of decay in the United States and other places happening on around the place, polarization. All of these are signs of corruption, and also just straight up massive corruption. Not talked about enough in the world. It's so fascinating. There's so much talk about injustice, but the issue of just massive transnational, massive corruption, economic is not spoken about. So I would place us somewhere between, I hope we're at 3.
Yeah.
But I think we're somewhere between 3 and 4, possibly well into 4.
Yeah.
I don't think we're not at Barriet stage yet, but I would put us just moving from 3 into the beginnings of 4, stage 4. So moving from third generation assumes it, entitlement, into fourth generation neglects it, and corruption starts to happen.
Yeah, okay. Would you say that the church, let's have a look at the church.
Yes.
Is in a different place?
Okay, so I think we've talked a lot about the church here, and well, that's because we're a church. We are a church. It's not just all pastries. So, I think that it looks a bit different with the church, and I think the issue of assuming things becomes even stronger. So I feel like part of the Western church is very much, I'll put us in the third stage, strong into third, depending on what country you're in, but strong into the third stage of assuming it. I think generationally, we're at a massive transitional point.
Yes.
Which is the baby boomer generation is starting to resign and move into retirement, and will start to pass in the next 10 years. So a lot of the energy, and maybe even if you had to sort of look at it, you say, in some ways the baby boomer generation maintained it. The ones who stuck around, they maintained some things. You go before that, you look at the builder generation. I saw some data the other day on giving in the church to churches, and I think it was Christian NGOs. And by far the elder generation, which is the builder generation, like the generation who gave birth to the boomers, give the most by far. And it just declines to the point where sort of Generation Z virtually gives nothing, millennials hardly anything, Gen X not much, boomers a bit. So that's just an example, I think, of the way we've talked here before about, we're in the car on the freeway and we've just been coasting, but now the car's rolled to a halt. So I think that's where we are. So I think a lot of assumptions being made at the moment are that seminary Bible college will still be around in 5 years. That's, that church, which seems large, but has 75% of people in the baby boomer demographic, that's not going to be large. There'll be denominations that in the next 10 years, lose 75% of their backsides on seats. So I would say the church, we're somewhere between third and fourth. Now I'm saying that broadly, the church in the West, people listening saying, oh, the American church is this, or, the Canadian church is that. I'm trying to be as broad as possible here.
Yes.
But I think definitely we're at this moment between 3 and 4th. And it's just fascinating that's happening at the same time that the culture, what's changed is, we were having these conversations 5 years ago, you wouldn't be looking at the culture moving to the 4th generation of starting to fall apart. So these two things are happening simultaneously.
Okay, well then what do we do with this if we are holding and stewarding the church for the next generation as leaders and followers of Jesus?
Okay, so another way of looking at generational decline is a kind of forgetting.
Okay.
So I think we mentioned them before, but in their book How Democracies Die, Ziblatt and Levinsky,
sounds familiar.
Those guys.
Yeah, I do remember putting it on.
They talked about that institutions decline because they forget their robust norms. Yeah, robust norms are the values that an institution begins with that are passed on, and they're actually hard to codify. They're hard to put into governance. They're hard to pass down in a way that's not life on life, and they get forgotten. They get forgotten. So part of the conversation in the United States at the moment about the sort of political decay you see in the United States is that people keep talking, the political norms have been broken. People are like, Trump broke this norm. Biden did his speech the other day, and people are like, oh, he's now breaking norms as well. It's like you can see the sort of decay. People are doing stuff they wouldn't have done before, and that's a neglect of norms. You know, I can't remember. Someone in the office was talking about, they saw an interview. Someone was telling me they saw an interview with someone who was talking about, you know, it was a Republican or a Democrat from, 30 years ago saying, oh, we used to eat together. We don't eat together anymore.
Yeah,
so you'd have a fight in the house or whatever, but then you would go and have dinner together and you're still sort of friends. That's decline of norms. Now, Samuel Berger talks about essential knowledge, that there's kinds of essential knowledge that first pioneering startup generation get.
Yes.
But that's forgotten. And so all of this I would boil down to the first generation discovers the special sauce, the ingredients of the special sauce, and it's passed down through generations, but future generations just assume that there's enough of a plentiful supply of the sauce. They don't know how to make it. And they've forgotten the ingredients. And then it's the point that they've got no sauce left. So I actually think that the good news here is that renewal can come when you discover the special sauce of the first generation. Now, I think this is where we're at as the church. And I think that not enough people look at this. I think a lot of people look at, we've got this program, or we look at renewal in this way. We've got a heart for it. But do we have the desire to go back and find the ethic of the first generations and what were the ingredients that made the special sauce? Because if you can return to that, you can turn things around again.
So can I ask, in that view, does that mean if we do exactly what the first generation did, that it's going to bring renewal, or is it, is it going to look exactly the same?
Great question.
Do you know what I'm kind of asking?
I think it often looks different.
Yes.
But I think there's a posture.
Yes.
So there's patterns.
Yeah.
Patterns might look different. But there's actually a posture. Like, if we did everything that John Wesley did, is a renewal going to break out? Now, John Wesley often is lauded for going out and preaching in the fields.
Yeah.
Now, part of the reason contextually he did that isn't just because he just wanted to do mission. It was also that, Charles and John Wesley were sort of banned from speaking in Anglican pulpits in Bristol and London.
Yeah, okay.
And there was all kinds of laws that if you're a nonconformist or a dissenter versus an Anglican, where you could preach, and certain bishops had said, you're not preaching in these places. So they sort of went and did in the fields because they didn't have anywhere else. Now, that's not our context. I can preach at different churches, so, street preaching was an absolute sensation in that day.
Yeah.
Like the fact that people like Benjamin Franklin, when heard, Whitfield and David Garrick, one of the leading actors of the 18th century, would go and listen to Wesley and stuff like this. So it was a cultural sensation. So if we went and did that pattern, that may not result. But there's a posture.
Yeah.
There's a posture that you see, in a Whitfield or a Wesley. And I think that's partially the essential norms that gets forgotten.
Yes, yeah, and it's that ethic of sacrifice.
Yes.
So that ethic of sacrifice and the postures that worked in the past, or that were what led to building something that was then able to be sustained. They're the things that we're to look at. But our contexts are completely different. Like Red Church here in Melbourne is completely different to a church in I don't know, regional, I don't know where, somewhere.
I mean, I was talking to someone. I was talking about this in recently.
Finland. Thank you, Daniel.
I was talking recently at a conference, and I was talking about some of the stories of the Welsh revival, and it was interesting. And often this will happen where someone will come up and they'll be older, and they're like, "My parents lived through that, and I remember this." And for them, it's not just like my parents went to church and they sung a lot in the Welsh revival. It's like I remember they remember what it felt like.
Yeah.
They remember it's like a lived experience that they saw their parents do. It's like when you. When we interviewed Scott Sauls the other week, and he talked about what it was like to be discipled by Tim Keller.
Yeah.
I understood that what he was saying in a different way than if I just read about Tim Keller.
Yes.
Like you can see the life on his life had been touched by Tim Keller. We were experiencing it through Scott's life. And even last week with David Yeganadze, hearing the stories of the Iranian, sort of renewal. It's one touch away from it. So what are the postures that people take versus just the patterns. And I think at the moment that's really key because I think there's a lot of chat around formation and patterns and practices, and we talk about that stuff. But patterns and practices without the right postures are not going to bring renewal.
Yeah.
Which is challenging in the time we live in because we want that what's the 5 things I need to do that'll turn this ship around, or just give me those tangibles and I'll go do that and make it happen. But what you're saying is something deeper than that.
And this is really key because what institutions will do when they hit crisis is make rules or more bureaucracy. And I think it's Tainter talks about in the rise and fall of complex societies. I haven't got the title exactly right, but his theory is that his theory of decline, which is a pretty sophisticated one, I think is primarily around that actually sort of bloated bureaucracy. Like societies get more and more complex, they then struggle to deal with that complexity.
Yes.
They create more complex responses to the complexity, which then creates a collapse.
Yes.
So, for example, at the moment, you just look, Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Welcome to the job, Liz, from Rebuilders.
If you're listening.
I'm sure she's listening. She'll be at the cafe next week. You had stimulus, a growth of stimulus to do with the GFC, so quantitative easing. And then when the pandemic hit, well, what do? Well, we do more of that, more.
Yes.
And then they just said, we're going to do these energy caps and we're going to so they're now doing more stimulus, to deal with the effects of the last stimulus. Do you know what I mean? So it sort of bloats and create, you're kicking the can down the road. So bureaucracies can often, what they do is, let's get everyone together, let's get focus groups, let's all do this, let's go, what were the things? So they create bureaucratic responses, and you do need to codify and you do need to institutionalize. But you can do that and still miss the essential knowledge, the special sauce, the robust norms. That's why this is a real danger. So, what can happen is just more bureaucracy bloated, in your organization without ever really getting to the sense. So you just increase the patterns and practices, but you don't get to the posture.
Yeah. Well, with that in mind, do you have any ways of us understanding what those ingredients of the special sauce, as you call it, are?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, yes is the short answer. The caveat is we at Rebuilders are always just trying to work this stuff out as we do it. This is very real in our church, and this is like often what you hear on Rebuilders is stuff we were sort of scratching through in team meetings 3 weeks ago. But I think in thinking about this, I picked out 3 postures that I think you see in turnaround pioneering generations. Now, the first one is absolutely horrifying, and I need to just give a sort of trigger warning to this because people will be shocked and drop their pastries. But I just think I have never found a first pioneering generation in anything, be it religious or building something, in the secular world, that did not have commitment.
Yeah.
And it was funny the other day, I was thinking about this and on Instagram just came up some random thing, a video, I don't even know how, of these 2 triathletes talking, because I don't follow any triathlete videos and I'm not a triathlete.
That surprises me.
I'm a triathlete of pastries. My pastries got in the way of it, just an incredible triathlete career.
It's a real shame.
But it was interesting, and there was this young woman who's a triathlete talking, and she said the difference between sort of triathletes and normal people who do fitness, she said normal people have an interest or sort of an affection for something. I'd love to get fit. I'd love to run that marathon. But triathletes have commitment. And she said commitment is what makes you turn up again and again and again when you don't feel like it, when it's raining, when you don't feel great, when you're depressed, whatever. You keep moving towards that goal of flourishing. So if you think about institutions are repeated patterns that humans do in a social form towards a future flourishing. Now, what undermines institutions is entitlement. Commitment's actually in some ways the opposite of entitlement, because entitlement is wanting the flourishing without the responsibility or doing what gets the flourishing.
Yes.
Commitment ensures that you build towards the flourishing regardless of what your, let's put it in biblical terms, your flesh is fighting against.
Yeah.
So we have this, biblical vision of renewal. What's going to stop you is when your flesh gets in the way. Commitment helps us push through that. And I think this is one of the huge challenges in the church. If we're looking at what's the great threats to the social order, it's energy crises, it's war, it's blah, blah, blah. The big threat for emerging generations in the church that will cause a civilizational decline in churches and Christian organizations is a lack of commitment.
Yeah.
And literally people will openly tell you they're commitment phobic. And I think what we're seeing is if repeated patterns move us towards the good, you're now seeing, particularly after the pandemic, in sort of this languishing moment of the pandemic, people are coming every week and are coming every 2 weeks. People are coming every 2 weeks, coming every 4 weeks. There is less and less commitment. People are more likely to move around. And we might get into why some of that is, I think, in perhaps a future episode, because I think some interesting sort of reasons why this is all happening. But the special sauce ingredients that every pioneering generation has is commitment. So if you're out there and you're like, I got a heart for renewal, I'll rebuild this thing, I'm just going to give it to you straight. You are not going to build anything without a commitment.
Yeah. And that's personal commitment, but that's also inviting others to be committed.
A community of commitment. And if just you have got a personal commitment and you're surrounded by others who haven't got commitment, you're going to get burnt out and it'll fall over. And that commitment, I think, has to come from a spiritual place.
Yes. Yeah.
It can't, there's grit your teeth. There'll be triathletes out there who are just freaks who've just got incredible commitment. But for ordinary human beings, which I presume most people are listening are, that it's actually, when you think about Jesus' commitment to us of what he does on the cross, that then grace, that is the out of what our commitment must flow. That our Savior was willing to go to the cross for us. And then in disciples, we ask, well, what are we willing to do for him?
Yes.
So that commitment has Christ-centered commitment, number one, special sauce ingredient.
Great. I just need a moment there. All right. Number two.
Special sauce ingredient number two. Actually cooking this up on the stovetop. This is the original ethic, sacrifice. You do not get a generation who's like, I want to keep my options open. I want everything I want now. I want all the freedoms I have now, and I'm going to build something incredible.
Yeah.
You're not going to have it. You can't have it all. Which is the name of my power ballad that I'm currently
You're doing backing vocals this afternoon.
Yeah, multi-layers here in the studio, and screaming guitar solos.
Can't wait.
Sorry, I have no musical ability. If anyone is listening at home, sacrifice. You have to sacrifice. It's a narrow path. Commitment will inevitably lead to sacrificial living. Like sacrificial giving. Like we're in a conversation again. Just being honest, we're talking about like many churches where looking at giving, and as we sort of emerged, and this is a challenge for many churches. And part of the conversation was how do we get back to normal? And I think it was you, Liddy. Was it you?
I don't know. It could have been. I don't know what you're about to say.
Said the actual vision of sacrificial giving. Was it you?
Might have been me. I don't know. It's
just
a while ago since
Just claim it.
I definitely said it.
Yeah. But like, what if instead of no, it was not you. It was in a board meeting.
Okay.
Similar.
I can throw my voice.
Yes. Throw your voice to the body. But just this idea that sacrificial giving actually opens up something that just getting to the baseline of what you need to operate doesn't.
Yes.
You can get to the baseline and continue to do things from an earthly manner, but actually sacrificial giving opens up something spiritually.
Yes.
That, when you turn up and you're the only one at the prayer meeting at 6 a.m., it just does something that it doesn't when it's an easy hour for you. Like there's just something sacrificed. Now, obviously this needs to be in balance, and I'm not saying, after a season where many people are rethinking the life script of high performance and running around like a headless chicken. So it's not doing more and more and more and more. It's actually doing less and less and less, but doing the things with absolute kingdom leverage.
Yes.
Which comes through a sacrificial heart. Again, too, this flows from the cross. Jesus sacrificed God sacrificed his only son. Like this sense that we must give at this point.
That's good.
Perseverance is the third special sauce ingredients. Commitment, sacrifice. Perseverance is this then going forward in time and keeping on going. This is also a recognition that's not always going to feel great. Yeah. Perseverance comes against the cultural blockage of what we do when it doesn't feel good, because freedom is a huge cultural idol, but also good feelings are a cultural idol. And people who build stuff, like I think there's this myth in the culture. I think I showed an ad like a while ago in church, and I think it was for like a start. There was some guy who yell if you remember this. It was like an ad, and I haven't even said what it is. No, so you guys are looking at me strangely. And it was like a startup guy, and he starts some company with his mates, and then you see like a little bit in the future, he goes from a great idea to like he's in some cool like co-working space, and surrounded by cool people, and they're working, all his friends, and they're working together on this business, and that's his new working reality. It's like a combination of recreation, social life, and work, and it's the ultimate dream. And the ad ends. Do you remember that ad?
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah,
I don't
remember what it was for, but it's probably some banking ad or something.
Yeah. And I think that's almost the vision today that, I want to find this thing to do that's going to be pioneering, do it for God, and it's the more I do it, the better I'm going to feel.
Yeah.
Whereas, I think if you look at, the scriptures speak of perseverance, and they speak of that as an element of discipleship and continuing on when things feel bad and are inconvenient and difficult, and when people come against you, when it's not popular in the world. Perseverance is one of those postures that every sort of first, generation who builds something must have. So commitment, sacrifice, perseverance, 3 postures that people need, has to come from us submitting ourselves to the Holy Spirit. But we can't turn anything around. We can't build anything around. Those are the robust norms that are currently declining. And any organization, you come up with your whiz-bang plans, that's great, but it's going to fall over without those key elements.
And I wonder, they're great. And it's just reminded me of something that we've talked about a number of times, is when you are discouraged and when you are like, what on earth am I doing here? You come back to that primary call. What has God asked me to do? What has God asked me to lead? What has God asked me to put my hands to? And I'm going to commit to do that. I'm going to sacrifice to do that, and I'm going to persevere in doing that. And if you're doing that with a group of people who are also on that same path, that's what the kingdom is, right?
And just last week's episode, for those who listened, I just think of those 3 postures in the Iranian church were all there, to the point where they couldn't even run a program. But they incredible commitment to the gospel, incredible sacrifice for the gospel, and perseverance, So that story last week, it's not even like, well, how were they using technology? Like, it's not even that. It's like, that's all secondary to these key postures. And I think you're right. It goes back to that first call. And it's interesting too, you often forget. I don't know if you've ever found the thing, you look back in a journey and you're like, actually that thing I've been wrestling with, actually God called me to that a year ago and actually the year before, and I just keep forgetting, and you got to remember to go back to that.
Yes.
So this forgetting is a key element of decline, but remembering the call is a key element of renewal. Yeah.
Awesome. Love this chat. Well, we'll leave it there for today. We'll probably explore a little bit more on this in subsequent weeks. Thank you so much for joining us. If you do want to grab a list of the numerous books that Mark mentioned today, you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co and clicking on the appropriate link. And we'll catch you next week.